She was a crime lab technician, a fingerprint analyst expert, doing fingerprinting and much more. She worked on several high-profile cases, and then her career took an interesting turn. Welcome to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. In the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, we are joined by special guests talking about their experiences, the realities of investigating crimes, plus those who have experienced horrendous trauma. Police, first responders, military, and victims of crime share their stories. Hi, I'm John J. Wiley. In addition to being a broadcaster, I'm also a retired police sergeant. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com, and also like us on Facebook. Search for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. The show was brought to you by OPPS, Operational Police Protective Services. They provide professional, safe, and effective security services in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and will be expanding to other states soon. Get more details at oppsprotection.com. Joining us from California, San Diego area of California, we have Rachelle Babler on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Rachelle, I met at Creative Con in Chicago, and wonderful person, great story, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. She was a latent fingerprints forensic specialist for law enforcement agencies in Southern California, and she did that for a very long time. She worked some high-profile cases, and then all of a sudden quit. Just cold turkey quit. We'll talk about the reasons why in a few moments. Rachelle, thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me, Don.
And thanks for your service. Look, I've said this a long time. I didn't hear that a lot when I was on a job. And when people tell me now that I'm retired and they find I'm a retired police and they go, thank you for your service, I'm like, I don't know how to answer that. But here's the thing. We never say that to the crime lab technicians. We don't say that to our dispatchers. We don't say that to all the support staff, the non-sworn personnel that really do a lot of behind-the-scenes grunt work. So thank you for your service. It's very much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
And a lot of people don't see that. They don't see, you know who I had on the show a long time ago? Alina Burrows. She was Orange County Sheriff's Department crime lab technician and worked on the famous case, the Kaylee Anthony case, and she talked a lot about behind-the-scenes stuff. And we're talking about a couple of cases you worked in. Briefly, tell people what your job was.
So my job was in law enforcement. Originally, I was transitioning from one career to another, from being a paramedic to going into forensics. And my first job was with a local law enforcement agency here in San Diego, a very small one. And I started interning. I got hired part-time. And in that capacity for that small agency, you know, when you work at small crime labs, you tend to do a lot more because there's only a few of you doing many jobs. So I was a forensic specialist, and I would go to crime scenes, process the crime scenes, take evidence, collect evidence, take photographs, bring all that evidence back to the crime lab, process the evidence for the presence of like biological fluids, for latent prints. And then, you know, many of the things that we needed done, like DNA analysis, would be outsourced to the sheriff's lab. So when I moved over to a larger agency, which is a full service lab, the larger agencies will have separate units for each of those specialized disciplines. So the one that I worked at had a DNA unit, it had a firearms unit, it had a latent print unit, a crime scene unit. So there, my focus was strictly on latent prints. So what I would do is analyze latent impressions that have been collected from crime scenes, from evidence, and compare those prints to, you know, possible suspects, witnesses, or search those prints through a database to see if we could try to find the source of the print. So I did that for almost 18 years at that agency, just really focusing on latent impressions.
And then you just one day decided, I'm done with this. I'm over it.
I did. Yes, I did. I fast forward, I was about 20 years into forensics, and I was on a flight back from a board meeting that I was on, a forensic board that I was on, and it was a very prestigious group. That was probably one of the highlights of my career, getting onto that board, and I was flying back from a meeting from New York to California. And, there was something that was telling me for some time, my intuition, our gut was always telling us something, and it was telling me there was more for me to do in this life. And I kind of ignored it, but I couldn't ignore it on that flight. It was like my intuition was like screaming at me. It's like, it's time to quit. And I just felt it in my entire body. I knew it was the time. And I went back to work, and that Monday I gave my 2 weeks notice and I quit. And I had nothing planned. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I knew
no fallback position. You said, that's it, I'm done.
Nope. I had nothing. Yeah.
That's quite a leap of faith,
Yeah, it's a huge leap of faith. And I knew I would figure it out. And maybe that's just part of the way I've always been built and wired. I'm a pretty tenacious person. And, there was divine timing in me quitting, because the year after I quit, my father and sister both passed away. And having been able to then work remotely gave me so much time to spend with them. So, sometimes we don't know why we're supposed to do some things, but when we trust it, you'll see why it all happens,
Well, first of all, there's a big difference between you and me. Number one, I would be the guy who's extremely paranoid on the airplane. I would be focusing on everybody. I can't sleep, and I do very little thinking because I'm so focused on what everybody else is doing. And it's not because I'm a busybody. I have relatives that we travel, they fall fast asleep. And I'm like, I'm not sleeping somewhere where some guy can come and start do whatever he wants to me. I'm not doing that. So, and then I don't think a lot. So all of a sudden you had this screaming at you. How would you describe that? You said, I'm paraphrasing, you had this inner voice saying, it's time to do something different. You're meant for more in this life. And it was screaming at you. You couldn't ignore it anymore. You've been ignoring it for a while before that.
Yep. Yeah, it's hard to explain, but I will tell you one thing. I was diagnosed with a brain tumor in 2008, and
Girl, you need to stop. What else can you throw into this mix?
Yeah, and I would say that time is when I really jumped into personal development work, and I started doing things I'd never done before because I was scared. I thought I was going to die. I had a newborn, an 18-month-old. I was married, and that really kind of changed my perspective on a lot of things. And I did one thing that was really, for me, I felt was one of the best things I'd ever done, was starting to meditate. And I really think when you meditate, you really connect to your soul's, essence and what you're meant to do in this lifetime. And so over the years, over almost 10 years of doing that, my intuition became very strong, and I would just let my intuition guide me. And so I knew it was the right thing to do, and I couldn't explain it to people. Everybody told me I was having a midlife crisis. I was 47. People, this is what happens to people at your age, Rachelle. But I knew it was my midlife awakening. It was an awakening to really start doing something different. And I'd done my service for 20 years. I was incredibly grateful for all that I'd been a part of and involved in, but it was time for me to do something in my next, second half of living.
Well, to borrow a pun, you had to hand the gloves, and I'm not talking about boxing gloves. You gave up the forensic gloves. You gave up the surgical gloves, for lack of better words. When we return to our interview with Rachelle Babler, we're going to talk about a couple high-profile cases she worked on in law enforcement as a forensic specialist. We're going to talk about fingerprints. We're going to talk about the realities of doing that job and much more. Remember when news was free? Be sure to check out the Newsbreak app. It's free. And be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. Newsbreak is your #1 local news app for current events. Free live news for you and your community. Download the Newsbreak app today for free, and be sure to follow the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. That's the free Newsbreak app. Be sure to look for and follow the Law Enforcement Talk radio show and podcast. This is Law Enforcement Talk radio show. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. The show was brought to you by OPPS, Operational Police Protective Services. They're dedicated to creating a safe environment, building trust, and enhancing the quality of life for their clients. They're committed to delivering quality service, safety, and security in an effective, responsive, and professional way. Get more details at OPPSprotection.com. The Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show is brought to you in part by Colonial Metals Group. Protect your family's financial future with gold and silver. Their level of professionalism makes it easy for you to learn everything you need to know about preserving all you've worked for. Take advantage of a special offer for our audience, and you'll receive a safe and up to $10,000 in free silver. Call 800-898-1841. 800-898-1841. That's 800-898-1841, or go online to colonialmetalsgroup.com/LET radio. Return conversation on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show with Rachelle Babler. She is, I want to say, retired forensic specialist for law enforcement agencies in Southern California. And she did that for a very long time, almost about 18 years, and then quit. All of a sudden, just said, that's it. I'm done on a flight, coming back. I'm finished. I'm doing other things. Her website is RachelleBabler.com. That's RachelleBabler.com. Couple cases you worked on that are high profile, and I apologize in advance. I don't know them by the names, and quite often names these cases are given by the media. One is the AM series sex crime case. That sounds really, is it AM radio involved in that, or is it morning? What is going on with that?
Yeah. So in the, let's see, like it was the early 2000s, there was several rapes that were being committed in like the Ocean Beach, Mission Beach area of San Diego,
right.
Which is near the downtown area on the coastal side. And what had happened was this gentleman was going around and committing these rapes in the early morning.
You're a lot nicer than I am. I wouldn't use the word gentleman. I'd just say scumbag. Yeah. He was going around and he was committing these rapes in the early morning. So they deemed this series of rapes the AM rapist because it was like in the early morning hours of the day. And so there were several, rapes that had occurred, and it was one of the biggest unsolved sex crimes cases, from what I was told, for San Diego PD. And when I started in forensic and started searching latent prints through databases, we could search through the local database, we could search through the county, the county database, and then we could search through the state database. And then, we didn't really have access to like other databases at that time. It was, in the early stages of APHIS and these different types of systems that you could search through. So, the FBI database, when I first started, you would have to send a photograph, mail it to the FBI, and then have them search it through their database. It would take months and months and months to get like a response from it. So as things progressed and we got more access to databases and was able to search through, I had gotten this case, and it was several cases, obviously, that they were that they thought were tied together. So I had reevaluated some of the cases, and there was a print from one of the cases where I had my intern, I said, I think we should search this through the FBI. This was when we got the FBI database. And she searched it, and she's like, I think we got a hit. So here's the fallacy with, like, getting a hit. On TV, people will think, oh, you get a hit, and the person's profile pops up in their face, and it says identified, and really that's kind of like how we make an identification. And that's really not how it works at all, is it?
No, and we have to explain this a lot to jurors, because jurors watch TV, and they think that things happen like they do on TV. So when we think we have an identification, or, we've identified the source, then you have to pull that person's fingerprints, and then you take the original latent print that was collected from the crime scene, and you do manual comparison. So you do a comparison of the print to the person, and then you come to a conclusion whether you can identify it, you can exclude it, or maybe you can't really say.
Right.
And so I identified the print, and then what we do there is I have to have another examiner identify that print. They verify it, and they go through the same process and verify the print. So I had that done. And once that's done, then I can call the detective and let them know, hey, we have an identification on this case to this print.
One of the things that I want to jump in very quickly is, I'm not an expert like you, but when we had AFIS, which is Automated Fingerprint Identification System in Baltimore, and what they would do is they take the scan of the latent print, and they would check off different indicators with loop, swirl, whatever it might be. And I think it was 15 of them. And they put it in there, and then they run a test through the database and see which ones matched, and usually came up with 10. Usually it was one of the top 3. But they would have to then manually inspect the print that is compared to the latent they have and see if there was a match. Is that what you had to do?
Yeah, so we, if I have a latent impression, which is an impression that's been collected from a crime scene on a card, then I would take the information in that print. Usually it's AFIS looks for identification markers such as like ending ridges and bifurcations. Right. So we would mark ending ridges and bifurcations, as many as that we could see in that print. And then we would, say what type of pattern is it? Is it an arch, loop, or whirl? That narrows down the focus. And then, and if you don't know, you just don't know. And then, you put those indicators in, and then you would do a search. But obviously you want those indicators to be clear and robust, not something that you're guessing, and do that search. And then, a score would come back, and it would have like the top, people that it thinks might match this print. And so usually you look at the first one, and then you start going down the list to see if you have a match through one of those.
And how long did this process take? This was years after the crime, am I right?
Yeah, so the process of searching the prints is much faster now. When I first started, we would have to wait maybe 24 to 48 hours just for a local search to get results back. Now it's within minutes. I mean, it's really, really fast. The process is, you just have to analyze those prints. Which ones do you think are of quality and help fit the criteria of a search? And then you take those, and then you manually extract that information from the print, put it into the system. You have to put all the case information in, and then search it through. And then you have to, then start comparing the results to that print. Well, this was just one print on a case that I'd searched. I'd compared others, but, I've had cases where there's hundreds of prints in a case, and then I have to, figure out which ones are of AFIS quality, which ones am I going to search, and then, and so it can take a long time depending on the magnitude of the case, how much evidence you have, and how many prints you have.
I got to ask this because of those television shows. Number one, they always have really cool background music going on. I'm sure that was not the case for you.
I know, we should have that, right?
Yeah, we should. Look, I'm an old guy, Rachelle. We've met. I think of Miami Vice, and I hear certain songs, and back then I go, oh, man, that show was the bomb back in the day. Nowadays, I watch it like, no, not so much. The other one was there's always some boss-type figure leaning over the shoulder of the technician. Hey, get this done. And there's a lot of drama built up in it. The reality is that was not the case for you, was it?
No, in fact, we were an accredited lab, and there's, certain procedures and things to put in place to prevent bias or pressure. Our job is to analyze the evidence and to present the findings.
There we go.
And not be swayed by, any bias around that case or anything like that.
The old saying we have is follow the evidence and develop your case from there, not the other way around. This is Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. We're going to turn our conversation on Rachelle Babler in just a few moments. Don't go anywhere. I promise you, we will be right back. Our sponsor, Colonial Metals Group, helped me with my goal of protecting my financial future. Being at the whim of the stock market or the current administration doesn't make me feel safe or secure. But having a self-directed IRA where I can safely store gold and silver, assets that have stood the test of time, no matter what the economy or the government policies are, makes sense to me. Colonial Metals Group has helped me create a self-directed IRA where I can have direct access to my assets. Let the team of experts at Colonial Metals Group help you protect your family's future. Their level of professionalism and ability to listen make it easy for you to learn everything you need to know about preserving all you've worked for. Maybe you're just thinking of getting started, or maybe you've already in a 401k or IRA. You're thinking about your parents' retirement. Regardless, Colonial Metals Group can help. We put together a special offer for our audience. Call 800-898-1841. 800-898-1841. That's 800-898-1841. Or go online to colonialmetalsgroup.com/LET radio. Returning conversation with Rachelle Babler on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. Rachelle is a retired law enforcement forensic specialist from Southern California. She did it for about 18 years and then suddenly quit. On a flight, coming back from New York to California, she's like, that's it. I am done. I'm moving on to other things. And no, it's not like she was fed up with it. It was for different reasons, which we'll talk about in a few moments. We're talking about the AM series sex crime. Oh, by the way, her website is RachelleBabler.com. That's RachelleBabler.com. We're talking about the AM series sex crime case. And before we went to the break, you talked about the lab eliminating bias, the pressure, all that stuff that we become accustomed to with television. That doesn't happen that way at all. Never, and really never really has that I know of. But in your case, it didn't for sure. You got the identification. You had someone else corroborate it, make sure you're on the right track, and then you did notification of the detective, and take it from there.
Yeah, and I remember talking to the detective. I said, we got a hit on this case. It was a FBI hit. And, and then they start pulling the information from that person and start looking to see, they start their investigation on it. And so the detective flew out to, this person was in Chicago at the time, I believe, and flew out there and went to go get a DNA sample. Because, the DNA could really show if these cases, if this was the person and these cases were done by the same person, then the DNA could perhaps show that. So, and all these cases when someone gets sexually assaulted, there's a rape kit that's done, and swabs are taken from, various parts of the body and then collected for examination. So, they went out there, or he went out there, I don't know how many went out there, and they got the swab sample, came back, and the DNA matched to those cases for this series. So then they arrested him, brought him back, and usually as somebody that's working a latent print case, I tend to have to then fingerprint the suspects.
Right.
Because I need to get major case prints, and major case prints is when you collect all the ridge detail on their hands and their feet if you need footprints, and you collect all the detail of it. So, I've had to fingerprint a lot of these suspects in these cases, like murder cases, and I'll tell you, just that part of it is an interesting thing, especially when I have to go to the jail and do it. So I took his major case prints, and then I used those to really have good quality prints to compare to the other cases. But the DNA is really what kind of solidified things for this case as far as tying all the other ones together. And so it was, I believe, 10 years later, he pleaded guilty to 5 counts, I believe, of forcible rape and admitted to, multiple, attempts or whatever.
Right.
And he was sentenced to, I believe it was 75 years to life in state prison.
Well, good on you, and good on all the detectives that worked on that. And I want to say this, that sex crime cases involving strangers are very hard to prove. They're very hard. And I would love to get your response on this. Fingerprints, it used to be back in the day, there could be a reason why a fingerprint was there, and it becomes an investigative tool quite often more so than probable cause. DNA, if it exists, is the nail in the coffin for a lot of these bad guys. Am I wrong?
Well, I think they both can tell very different stories. Obviously, DNA, the tests now are so sensitive. Like, you can get DNA on a lot of things. And, having both the fingerprint and the DNA, obviously, the more evidence, the better, because then it shows it's not just one thing. It shows multiple things. But, the fingerprints can obviously tell a story, too, like where was this latent print left? Where was it touched?
Right.
Was it on the window where, the person came into, the house of the victim? I think latent prints are still quite robust in cases, and DNA obviously is as well. But yeah, they both can tell different stories or corroborate each other as well.
By the way, if you have a fingerprint inside a crime scene and they say, I've never been there, that's a dead giveaway. That's usually the suspect did. When it's like the outside of a car where, hey, I was walking on the street and I touched this car, it's a different story. And you got to keep on digging to get the evidence for probable cause for court. And that's a difficult thing. And I got to ask you this, Rachelle, before we go into the next case, which is the Danielle van Dam abduction and murder, is most of the fingerprints that we got, and when I say we, the crime lab technicians and the officers, were unusable. They were smudges, they were smears, they were not good. And you would think people are watching these television shows, there's evidence left at every crime scene, and that's not the case.
Yeah. Sometimes, and again, as things advance in technology, what's to say that those prints might not be able to be used, maybe from DNA or something. If you have a smear or something, there might be something in the future. I don't even know if they're doing this now, but where they could take some DNA from that tape list and use that.
In my career, and granted, I retired in 92, so things are drastically different now. And DNA really was in its infancy stages. But fingerprints, and my entire career, and I can't tell you how many handguns we recovered. Let's just say hundreds over 10 years with drugs, shootings, you name it. I can think of one case that stands out where a fingerprint was retrieved from a gun. And it didn't come from the gun itself. It came from the ammunition inside the gun, a semi-automatic. Yeah. That's how rare it is to get it on certain surfaces. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, sure. Certain surfaces play a factor and a role, I believe, with latent prints and with DNA. So, but yeah, I think from when I was leaving, DNA was definitely being used a lot more in cases because you swab an area. And, the DNA database has gotten quite big and large over the years.
I've seen some of these crime shows, and before we go on to the next case, where they do the interview and they go, oh, yeah, by the way, your DNA is a 1 in 6 billion in the entire world that is someone else. And you're like, they usually give it up. So it's something we didn't have back then. But a lot of the way these cases are made is the same way. It's gumshoe detective work, it's the crime lab technicians, it's the forensics people, all those things doing their job. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't be cracking these cases. Yeah, so it's important, I think, to just really, on those cases, to collect what you think is relevant, because you never know, we work old cases and cold cases, and there's cold cases, excuse me, where we didn't have a palm print database back then, 20, 30 years ago. And now we have a palm print database where you can search palm prints. So some of those, cases where you weren't able to do much back then, you probably certainly can do a lot with now. Was there a time where when you first started, you were actually on scene dusting for prints and doing all that stuff?
Yeah, when I first started in forensics, I was a forensic specialist. So I would go out to the crime scenes and dust for evidence and for latent prints and collect evidence and swab things as well.
And now you don't have to answer this, but did you curse a lot when it's going? Because when I remember those cases, and it's always in the worst circumstances. It's raining, it's hot, it's humid, it's freezing, it's one or the other. It's never under ideal circumstances like you see on television.
No. It's not like you see on television where I'm dressed in like nice fancy clothes and high heels and I have my makeup and hair perfect and, I'm out there, in a bloody pool with, my stilettos on. And
it was never like that. We're talking Rachelle Babler. She is a retired law enforcement forensic specialist from Southern California. Her website is RachelleBabler.com. That's RachelleBabler.com. We return to the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. We're going to talk about the Danielle van Dam abduction and murder case and her role in that. Of all the radio stations in the United States, there are no other shows like the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. And on Facebook, there's only one official page. Do a search on Facebook for the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. And be sure to like the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show Facebook page. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. OPPS, Operational Police Protective Services, provides professional, safe, and effective security services in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and will be expanding to other states soon. And they're hiring security and protection professionals. Off-duty and retired police officers, deputies, troopers, agents, and military in good standing are all encouraged to apply. That's OPPS, Operational Police Protective Services. Get more details at OPPSprotection.com. Again, that's OPPSprotection.com. Return our conversation on the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show with Rachelle Babler. She's retired forensic specialist from law enforcement agencies in Southern California. And her website is RachelleBabler.com, RachelleBabler.com. I'll give you a hint. She does a lot of work with personal development, personal growth. And when you hear more of her story, you'll know why in a moment. I want to go back to your career. You worked a case that was the Danielle van Dam abduction and murder case. You may not have been directly involved in that case, but that was a pretty prominent case where you were policing, for lack of better words, in Southern California, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a pretty high-profile case for our agency. And I was there at the time. I wasn't directly working the case, but I remember it because it was a high-profile one. And as you know, like high-profile cases are the spotlight's on the agency, right? And all the work that's being done.
Well, there's a misconception a lot of people have that we call them red balls in Baltimore. They might call something different where you were. And that if the politicians in City Hall and everybody else in the news media clamors more, you'll get more done. If the evidence is there, great. If it's not there, you can't manufacture it, can you?
No, I mean, we look at what we have, and what we have is what we have to analyze.
Tell us about the case. What was the prominent feature of that?
Yeah, so this was an interesting case because for many different reasons from a forensic perspective, but this young girl, Danielle van Dam, was kidnapped from her home in one of the suburb areas of San Diego. It was actually like her place was literally probably 5 miles from where I lived. And so, it's in an area where you don't have abductions and kidnappings often. Like, I live in a fairly safe area. They say San Diego is one of America's safest cities. And, right. There's not like really serious crimes where I live and in this area. And she was abducted from her home. This was in the early 2000s. And her body was found 3 weeks later. And so the police were obviously focusing on, that area, the home and, the area around it, interviewing the neighbors. And there was one neighbor that was not there at the time when she was abducted and it came out. And so when they interviewed this person later, one of the detectives, from what I recall, noticed that this person was, it seems like after interviewing him, he's very meticulous. I mean, he was, I can't remember what he did for work, but he was self-employed and he had like several patents for like medical devices and stuff. And he seemed very meticulous, but in the front yard, the hose was like all over the lawn and just like all over the place, which would seem out of sorts for somebody like him.
Right.
And so anyways, he became kind of a focus, and they started investigating things and ended up arresting him. But the thing about this case was, there was a missing body. There was, the body wasn't found for the first 2-3 weeks. So as a latent print examiner, I couldn't get, fingerprint exemplars to start comparing evidence to, the victim. Or then when they found her body, I know the latent print examiner that worked this case, had to go, and her body was partially, I think, mummified at the time. It was dumped like out in an East County remote area near a dump area where people would go dump trash. And so her body, I'm not sure how long it had been out there, but, as a latent print analyst, what part of our duties are, and a lot of people don't know this, I think we just sit in our desk with our head down and looking at prints all day, but we do go to the morgue and we try to get fingerprint exemplars from deceased persons. Right. And sometimes, if their body is mummified or decomposed, we sometimes have to take those parts with us back to the lab to try to rehydrate them.
That was a nice way of putting it, Rachelle.
Yeah, we have to sometimes take those fingers or hands with us back to the lab to try to rehydrate the skin so that we can get fingerprint exemplars from him. So, her body, like I said, it was pretty decomposed, and so, I remember this case. This was the interesting part about this case was, when Westerfield was arrested, the defense wanted a speedy trial. So as you know, when, everybody has a right to a speedy trial, and but there was a lot of evidence in this case because not only was there the victim's home, but he abducted her somehow from the house and put her into his motorhome, and he was gone from his motorhome for several weeks, I believe. And then her body was discarded at some point, and he came back, and then there was other evidence to then look at from, the motorhome, from his home, and all these things. So there was a lot of evidence to look at in this case. So when you are asking for a speedy trial, you have to get all this evidence analyzed within, a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. So what I recall from this case when I was working there was, the people in DNA, the guy I worked with who was working this case for latent prints, the detectives, the crime scene analysts. I mean, everybody was working like full-time, more than full-time, because, we wanted to see what the evidence would show. And it was very stressful because, I don't know if you remember, but I know that when you have a time crunch for a case, you want to make sure you're doing a good, thorough job in analysis, and but you have obviously a time crunch where things need to be done.
Right.
And many times from cases there isn't as much trace evidence, and trace evidence is hair fibers, paint, tire tracks. Trace evidence covers a lot of other things that can show up in cases, but it's not always like the most dominant of the evidence, if you will.
Right.
And so, but this particular case, there was a lot of trace evidence. There was, evidence of, her hair, I believe, in certain areas at his house or in comforters or pillow covers. There was, traces of blood of hers. There was a lot of trace evidence in this particular case. So that was like a pretty heavy part of the case evidence that was in it. It's not only the DNA and the trace evidence, but then the latent prints. And Jeff Graham, who analyzed the prints for this case, ended up identifying her prints in the motorhome near the thing that goes beside the bed, like where you put stuff in.
Was this guy convicted?
Yes, he was convicted.
Now, I want to change direction a little bit. You're flying, but you had 18 years plus on the job. And how close were you to retirement when you decided to quit?
So I had almost 18 years with the second agency. And, I could have retired about 8 years after that.
So it's not like you were a short timer. You weren't a rookie this. You were doing it for quite a while. And the fact that you left with that much time on the job probably alarmed a lot of people. But you're on the plane and you decide, that's it, I'm done, and there's no looking back for you. What are you doing now?
So now, so when I was in forensics, I did a lot of research, and I researched a particular area in latent prints, and I used that research to go teach law enforcement agencies all over the country. So I created a class out of it. I was speaking at forensic conferences, and I really liked to speak. And so when I quit, I really gravitated towards supporting speakers because I really enjoyed doing that. So for the past 7 years now, I can't believe it's been 7 years, I have been supporting speakers for various aspects, whether
Awesome.
connecting them to podcasts to be guests, connecting them to events to be a speaker, but primarily for the TEDx stage, which is
Awesome.
a global stage to really share your idea. We're spreading on the TEDx stage. So,
Rachelle, I'm sure that people can get more information about you and the services you offer your website, RachelleBabler.com. That's RachelleBabler.com. Rachelle, thank you for your service. Number one, thank you for being a guest on the show. Number two, very much appreciated.
thank you so much for having me, John.
Follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. It's free. And get the latest crime and law enforcement news on the Newsbreak app. It's simple, easy, and free. Just download the Newsbreak app. Then search for and follow the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast on the Newsbreak app. This was the podcast version of the nationally syndicated Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show, and we are so glad that you decided to join us. Big thanks to our guests for telling their story on the show. Two simple things you can do. Be sure to check out our website, letradio.com. That's letradio.com. And be sure to follow us or like us on Facebook. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show. And be sure when you see a post that we put up that you like, that you resonate with, that gets your attention, be sure to share it with your friends. Back in just a few days, another episode of the Law Enforcement Talk Radio Show and podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.